We're back with another installment in the CGC Census Count. We've hit the golden age of comic books and the granddaddy of them all. It's going to be on this list, but will it make it to number one? It's 1938. You have to know what I'm talking about, but there are a lot of other books to discuss coming up next on this video from Bronzeville Comics. Hello, panelologists. This is Jim from Bronzeville Comics coming to you with another video. And before we get started, please like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the description of this video for links to my Instagram, my whatnot, my eBay store, and my email. So I'd like to thank you all for stopping by. And we've been doing this for a few weeks now. We finally hit the golden age of comic books, getting some superhero stuff into the mix, including, you know what's coming. It's 1938, so there's no surprise in what's going to be on the list. And there's some other related books on the list as well. We're going to go through the books that on CGC data have the most blue label copies listed on the census. And especially for this period in time there, that is a huge distinction, right? The blue label, because there are plenty of restored books, qualified books, even now more and more conserved books. We'll talk about the top 10. We'll also talk about other books of import that didn't quite make the top 10. So let's take a look at the books on our top 10 list. And we're going to start off at number 10. And this book has 24 universal copies on the census. It is Action Comics number 5. The 5th appearance of Superman. It doesn't have any key distinction. Superman is not on the cover. A Leo Amelia cover. It wasn't unusual for Superman to not be on the cover for the first year or so of Action Comics. It took a while for them to realize that he was the moneymaker and that you needed to have Superman on the cover for the kids to grab this off the stands. This is so early in comic book history, and I think that's what's interesting about going through this year by year, is kind of seeing how the industry developed into what we knew it to be. Especially in the Golden Age. This is the very beginning of the Golden Age. So we get this cover with this guy in the desert, fighting, I guess, Arabs. And he's got a ripped shirt, probably no sunscreen. He's got jodhpurs, and he's holding his pistol like he's going to pistol whip somebody with it. I guess he's out of bullets. So, and probably outmanned. But you can see in the credits here, Jerry Siegel's story, the Superman story, obviously, Joe Shuster, Fred Gardner, and Bernard Bailey art. Bernard Bailey did some classic pre-code horror comics, but he also created Hourman and the Spectre, among others. Fred Gardner created Zatara. So this, again, has 24 universal copies on the census. Now, there is a three-way tie for 7th place. And in 7th place, one of those books is Circus, the comic Riot, number 1 from Globe Syndicate. And what's interesting here is, I don't even know, a complete comic strip, top-notch comics. This is kind of, you can see from the art in the middle, this is just all over the place. Very much a funny book. I don't know if these are reprints or not, but Basil Wolverine, who had quite a hand at the EC days. Will Eisner, creator of the Spirit. Jack Cole, creator of Plastic Man. And Bob Kane, creator of Batman. All had art in this book. So I'm not sure exactly what the stories of this are. But like 50 questions and answers, top-notch comics. 201 prizes, $201. Just, I don't know. A lot of stuff going on. This has 24 copies on the census. Actually, Action Comics 5 should be equal 7th as well, all 24. Another book with 24 copies on the census is from Dell Publishing, Crackajack Funnies, number 1. This is has, amongst others, has Tom Mix, who we talked about last year. He was a Western actor, an actor in Westerns, beginning in the silent era, and he had retired, I think, by 1935. Still had a radio show after his passing. I think he passed away in 1940. After his passing, he had his own comic book in the early 1950s. And then Don Winslow of the Navy, who was a comic strip character starting in 1934 in newspaper comic strips. And he had a fairly long-running series with Fawcett Comics in the 1940s. And you can see all the other Freckles. I guess maybe that's Freckles up there, like kind of with the little orphan Annie eyes. Dan Dunn, Captain Hawks, Apple Mary, Buck Jones, Wash Tubbs, Flapper Fanny, Annabelle, Clyde Beatty, Myra North, who I guess is a nurse, Columbus, the Explorer maybe, Major Hoople, Out Our Way, Boots, the Nebs, and G-Man. So I believe these are mostly, mostly reprints of newspaper strips. And that's kind of what Dell was doing at the time. Also, with 24 copies on the census, also with 24 copies on the census is Mickey Mouse Magazine. This is Volume 3, Number 4. It's the New Year's cover with Donald as Baby New Year and Goofy as Father Time. And this also begins the installations that tell the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Which had come out in 1937. That film came out, I believe, if I remember correctly. Again, Mickey Mouse, even he didn't get into the Cover Zone magazine here, but Donald and Goofy were popular enough among kids of the day to really have this book be bought seriously by kids. So all of those had 24 copies on the census. Now we're going to jump up to number 6 on the list. And it is Action Comics number 4, the 4th appearance of Superman, with this. The cover here is by Leo O'Amelia. He did a lot of these early action covers. And is that a werewolf or is that just a guy with a beard? I think it's just a guy with a beard. He doesn't have any talons. And a Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Yeah, I don't think they had supernatural characters. Just a guy in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Again, Action Comics, much like DC's other books at the time, they had, I think, at this time, they were publishing 4 titles. More Fun, Adventure, Detective, and Action. And all were anthologies. And they started to more and more, as we move over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, more and more make way for superhero titles. But Detective Comics had detective stories. And More Fun had more funny animals, humor strips. Adventure had Adventure. Now Action had action strips. So there are a couple superheroes in these books, and we'll talk about that when we get to earlier issues, let's say. So that's number 4. There are 28 Blue Label copies on the CGC Census. Let's go to number 5 on the list. And number 5 is the Cocomalt Big Book of Comics number 1 by Harry A. Chesler, featuring Joe Penner. Charles Biro cover, is that correct? It says Biro. Charles Biro cover and art. He did a lot of work for, what was it, like Daredevil and Boys Comics, Lev Gleason Productions later in the 40s. But see, Paul Gustafson, Jack Cole, Fred Gardner, and Bob Wood art. And this was a giveaway comic, which was very common in the Platinum Age and became less common as we got into the Golden Age. 29 copies of this on the census. Then let's go to the next book, which is a true key. It's Action Comics number 4. There are 30 copies of this. I'm sorry, Action Comics number 6, 4th on the list. There are 30 copies of this on the census. This another Leo O'Amelia cover. And this is with this gorilla on the cover. Gorilla covers like 25 years before DC, was popular gorilla covers. But these Leo O'Amelia covers are pretty cool. They do have this pulpish background, and they kind of hide what's inside. What's inside is another Superman story, and the key is the first appearance of Jimmy Olsen. He's not named in this story. I think he's just like cub reporter or boy reporter in this, but is the first appearance of a fairly major character. Did have his own long-running series. Has been portrayed in movies and TV over and over again for decades. So a very important part of the Superman mythos, and it looks like this gorilla is going to go power slap on this guy with the safari hat and the camera. So again, there are 30 copies of this on the census. Let's go to number 3 on the list. And number 3 is another DC comic. It is the New Book of Comics, number 2, 31 copies on the census. And this is just a compilation of all sorts of humor and action strips. It was not a title that lasted, but this kind of is a prelude maybe to World's Finest Comics in that where it's 96 pages in color. Those are the interior pages. If you include the cover, it's a 100-page book. The other books, like the Action Comics at the time, Detective Comics, etc., they were 68 pages, including the cover. And I believe these were, it does appear to be that it was square bound. Now, let's go to number 2 on the list. This is where things get pretty interesting in terms of how we look at this list. And number 2 on the list is Action Comics number 7. This is the second cover appearance of Superman. Talked about they did rotations throughout the early issues of Action Comics, the first year or so. And so Superman, it took him, he was the only one, like once every 6 months he got on the cover. DC at some point realized, yeah, he's going to sell the stuff, so we're going to put him out there. So this, by virtue of the fact that it's the second Superman cover for collectors who are big pocket collectors, but not big enough to afford Action Comics number 1. They pivot to this book. It's the second Superman cover, and so it is a very early. It's still from 1938, and it is an early appearance of Superman. There are 32 Universal Blue labels on the census, but in addition, there are 24 restored books. So, I think one of the things is, especially with him on the cover, by the early and mid-1940s, Superman was a very well-known entity in popular culture. So more so than some of these random adventure covers or, like the gorilla about to hit the photographer in the safari hat or any of these other things or some of the humor stuff, people knew who Superman was and might have been slightly more inclined to keep it. This book probably had a print run in the millions, and there are only like 56 that have been slabbed by CGC. There's probably about 100 or so of these in existence. This is number 2 on the list. So what's number 1 on the list? It should come as absolutely no surprise. What do you think number 1 on the list is? That's right. It's Action Comics number 1, the origin and first appearance of Superman, also the first appearance of Lois Lane and Zatara. This is the Rocket copy with the Rocket stamp on the right-hand side there. Classic cover. This is where it all began. This is where comic books changed. And I've been doing this year by year, and we have these newspaper strips and adaptations of characters that came from radio strips or from radio shows or newspapers or pulps or whatever. And now we have really Superman, I think, is going to be the first big star that premiered in comic books. There are other characters that premiered in comic books slightly before this, but they're not at the level Superman was. And it was fairly quickly evident that this was a concept that caught on, because we're going to see in the course of the next couple of weeks as we go through this that it's going to be copied over and over again. Two of the top 10 covers here have superheroes on the cover, both Superman. That's all there is. Maybe we'll see more in the honorable mention. We'll talk about that in a minute. There are 44 blue labels on the census, plus an additional 36 purple labels for restored books. So this is the most graded book on the census from 1938. That's no surprise, because if you have a copy of this book and you want to sell it, I mean, there are private collectors who they've had it. They're raw collectors. It's still sitting there. But if you're going to sell this book, you're probably not going to sell it raw. You're going to get it graded, which is because there's such an enormous difference in the value from, every grade point to the next. Enormous. And so even as a buyer, you want to be certain as to what you're getting, that it's not restored, and that it is complete and all that sort of stuff. So this is a book that the only reason you would keep it raw is if it's staying in your personal collection and you're a raw collector and you have ample money to buy Action Comics number 1. So I don't know what else can be said about this. I will mention, though, we talked about Zatara briefly. It says here that Siegel and Gardner story, Gardner and Bernard Bailey art, Joe Shuster cover art. Fred Gardner created Zatara. When she came along 26 years later, Zatanna was his daughter. He was in Action Comics for quite a while. I'm trying to think as to when he, how long his tenure in Action Comics stayed. And Fred Gardner went to other titles, and he created other characters that were magicians. The Zatara is, at the very least, inspired by Mandrake the Magician, who was, I believe, a newspaper strip character. But Fred Gardner created other magicians who also spoke their incantations backwards, which looks great on the printed page. To hear it is a little different. Zatara appeared in Action Comics up until, what issue? Issue 76. No, I'm sorry. He appeared further than that. His last appearance in Action Comics, he tapered off a little bit at the end. The last year or so, he wasn't really a regular. His last appearance was in Action Comics 141. He also appeared, I believe, in New York World's Fair Comics. His last appearance in Action Comics was issue number 141, which took him all the way till that is February 1950. So he was in the series for almost 12 years. So he was a long-lived Golden Age character. But I don't think at the time he was never considered a superhero on the level of some of the other superheroes who were members of the Justice Society or even the Seven Soldiers of Victory, etc. So, but still, and his first appearance is not driving this book at all. Let's take a look at the honorable mentions. So you needed to have 24 universal copies to make the list. What just missed? With 23 copies, Action Comics #2, also a Leo O'Melia cover. Second appearance of Superman. There's nothing else to be said about this. This obviously is hampered by the fact that Superman isn't on the cover. It is a pretty cool cover. I do like O'Melia's art. I mean, it has a nice dynamic style to it, especially for that time. It isn't very cartoony, but Superman's not on the cover. But it is second appearance of Action Comics #2, and there are 23 copies on the census. Another book that has 23 copies on the census is Detective Comics #18. This is a classic Fu Manchu cover by Craig Flessel. It's his last cover on Detective. He more went to Adventure and was working on Sandman for quite a while. So, again, a really cool Flessel cover. Racist, probably, but I do love the detail in this cover. That is a really nice cover. Again, 23 copies on the census. Another book that has 23 copies on the census is this one, Detective Comics #22. This is 5 months before Batman premiered, and it's the first cover appearance of the Crimson Avenger. The Crimson Avenger became a superhero member of the Seven Soldiers of Victory and donned a costume in 1941, I believe, is when he went from this, fedora and cape with a gun look to a more standard superhero costume. And Jim Chambers did the cover of this. So this does have some import, and in retrospect, in DC continuity now, Crimson Avenger is the first superhero in DC continuity because he existed back in 1938. Superman, there was no Superman in 1938 in current continuity. 23 copies of this on the census. Now, a couple of other key issues that we can talk about is here. Detective Comics #17. There are 21 copies of this on the census, and this is the first appearance of Fu Manchu in Detective Comics. Fu Manchu actually was in short stories written by Sax Rohmer And then some of those were collected into novels. He was in films starting in 1923, running all the way through the disastrous Peter Sellers film in 1980. He had an own comic strip from 1931 to 33. And he was, as I mentioned before when we saw that cover appearance, he was a racist character. Now, this is a pretty, I like this Craig Flessel cover. The way that he uses light on it is pretty awesome. And really, you know, we want to see the superheroes, but some of these early Golden Age covers are really awesome. We will see a few more. I even like the one with the gorilla on it in Action Comics. But Fu Manchu also was used later on when Marvel introduced Shang-Chi. He was Shang-Chi's father. They kind of moved away from that, even though I'm pretty sure that Fu Manchu is now in the public domain. But also his racist depiction, historically racist depiction, is problematic to say the least. So Marvel kind of rewrote their continuity there. 21 copies of this on the census. Let's go to another key book, and this is Donald Duck, #1, a magazine. It's the first Donald Duck book. And there are 20 copies of this on the census. This is a magazine size book, much like the Mickey Mouse magazine. And we talked about how popular Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck both were. They were in cartoon shorts that showed before feature films all the time at this point in history. Again, another book with 20 copies on the census, and I want one of them. Actually, 2 of them just came up in the from the Christine Farrell collection. 2 copies of this book just came up for auction, and it is Detective Comics number 20. And this is the first appearance of the Crimson Avenger. Detective Comics number 20 is the first appearance of the Crimson Avenger in comic books. I am looking for all those first appearances of the members of the Seven Soldiers of Victory. And I said, the Christine Farrell Complete DC Collection has had a lot of these books come through Heritage in their last auction, and there will be many more, I'm sure. And it is this has 20 copies on the census in a blue label. So again, the Crimson Avenger very much inspired by the Shadow of pulp stories and radio adventures. Now, another book of some significance that made the honorable mention here is Adventure Comics number 32. And this is the Craig Flessel cover of 2 guys fighting on a raft. This is the first Adventure Comics. It was previously titled New Adventure Comics in prior to this. Oh, New Comics. Yeah, it was originally New Comics, and then it became Adventure Comics. New Adventure, and then it's titled Adventure, starting with this issue, number 32. And, of course, Adventure Comics had a long run. We'll soon see superheroes come into this title. Eventually, Superboy became the headliner, and it birthed the Legion of Superheroes, and it ran for over 500 issues until DC canceled it in the 1980s. And this first issue, formerly New Adventure Comics. Interior front cover is a full-page Crimson Avenger ad. So, would I want that as part of my collection? I want it raw, I guess. But, you know, that's a tough book to get. And again, there are only 17 of this on the census. And the last comic I'm going to talk about is from David McKay Publishing, which reprinted newspaper strips. And you see here, starring Blondie, Believe It or Not, Jungle Jim. We did talk about that with issue number 1 of this series last year. And there are only 14 copies of this on the census. But what makes this a key is the first appearance of the Phantom in comic books. The Phantom was a newspaper strip created by Lee Falk in 1936. And I do believe the stories in here are reprints from his comic strip. Lee Falk remained drawing Phantom stories, writing and drawing Phantom stories, until his death 63 years later. He was doing Phantom until his death in 1999. And the Phantom comic strips are still being published. Some of these comic strips are still going. You can find them in digital form, you know, the most current ones. But that is the the deal with the Ace comics. So we see here 1938, first appearance of Superman. The superheroes are coming. We'll see more next year in 1939. When you tune in next week, same bad time, same bad channel, what's going to be number one on the list? I think that's always an interesting question to ask. So I'd like to thank you all for stopping by. You can take a look at a couple of my other videos here. And this is Jim saying until next time, enjoy your comics.